Hello everyone, welcome to lecture number 45. You are attending the course Introduction to Language and Linguistics, and this is Dripta. The title of today's lecture is Standard Language Ideology, and today with us we have two research scholars who are working in the domain. So, we have Abhijit with us, Abhijit Arjunan, and we also have Suma Chishti. So, they will be talking about the topic as well, which is based on their area of research. I hope you remembered that we talked about the difference between standard language and dialect in the previous lectures. We saw that there is something which is non-linguistic, which is determining the different factors. So, today we will be talking about a process which is known as the process of standardization. Let me talk about the idea of standardization initially, and then from standardization we will be moving to standard language ideology, which is the topic for today's lecture. So, if you think about standard language, you know that it is something different from the dialects, and we also said that it is a dialect with army and navy, if you remember, and we also said that standard language has written norms. It is a dialect with written norms. So, what do we mean by written norms? If you remember, we did talk about the example of dictionaries and grammars etc. as written norms. So, when we will be talking about standardization as a process, in contemporary sociolinguistics, people are also talking about something called the standard language ideology. So, I will be asking this question to Abhijit first. So, Abhijit, can you tell us what is standard language ideology? What do we understand by standard language ideology?
Yeah, so before we talk about standard language ideology, it is important to talk about how ideology basically affects most of the things we do. Most of the decisions that are taken even at an individual level are affected by ideologies that we have been indoctrinated to. So, the case of language standardization in the process which selects a particular variety of the language as a standard is also not an exception. So, there is an ideological stance present in how certain varieties are chosen as a standard, while certain varieties are considered non-standard. For instance, we can actually draw examples from many languages where dialects or varieties, to be put in precisely, varieties from certain areas and certain social groups are selected, while so the varieties from other social groups, and these social groups mostly belong to the lower strata of the society. So, the ideology present in the selection process of the variety basically makes standardization a tool, an ideological tool or an apparatus as we can call it. So, because there is this choice involved, there is choice, and these choices are made by people who are in power, and these people tend to choose, because when we talk about a standard language or any language for the matter, there is no, everything is arbitrary. So, when we say that okay, this is the better variety, the choice of the person who makes the decision is important. So, that is why it has been found that like standard language can be used as an ideological tool, and that is also where the concept of standard language ideology comes.
So, if we talk about the process of standardization, there are some stages involved with it. So, the first stage of standardization process is selection. If there are a number of linguistic varieties present in one area, one particular variety will be selected. Then the second stage is called codification. So, you already know about it from previous lectures. This particular variety, the selected variety, will be codified with the help of grammars, dictionaries etc., certain prescriptive texts. Then the third stage is elaboration of function. The the variety which is selected and some codified texts are created, then its use will be elaborately done. So, it will be used by different people and there will be promotion for the use as well. And then finally, the last stage is acceptance. Members of the community will accept that the selected and codified variety which is being used widely is now a standard variety. So, thank you Abhijit for clarifying this idea of standard language ideology, and you can easily understand that why we are saying that standardization process is I mean there is a kind of ideology behind the process. Now, I will come to Suma. Suma, I have a question for you. So, Suma, we know that we are working on, you are working on the historical process of standardization in terms of colonial Bengal. So, can you tell us the historical significance of the standardization process in terms of colonial Bengal, I mean from your work?
Yeah, with the rise of standard language, like there emerged a homogeneity in the language system, where a particular language is declared as the power, language of power, language of discourse and print. As Abhijit has rightly mentioned, with the rise of standard language, the concept of non-standard language is constructed. In colonial Bengal, rather 19th century colonial Bengal, the newly codified Sadhu Bhasha, literary pure Bengali language, was declared as the standard variety of vernacular Bangla, and it became the badge of national, cultural, social identity of the new middle class or the new social elite, or which is also alternatively known as Bhadraloks. With the formation of homogeneity in the language system, there is always reformation in educational world or educational domain. In colonial Bengal, implementing standard languages, well, the prime domain of implementing standard languages was the educational domain. But the implementing standard language on educational domain had some implication on the education for the marginalized section or for the users of non-standard variety of languages or even the traditional language users. In my research, I am looking into these things, like what is the implications of this kind of implementing standard language on education and from the perspective of colonial Bengal.
Thank you, Suma, for talking about educational factors. This is when we talk about elaboration of function, the third stage of standardization. We can always see that for the elaboration of function stage, education plays a major role. So, it is the codified texts are actually used in educational domain in order to establish the standard. So, it is very important for us to point this out. So, when you are working on the colonial Bengal, can you also tell us briefly about the work of Anindita Ghosh, who is talking about the importance of marginalized varieties as opposed to the standard in her work?
Yes, Anindita Ghosh has in her book Power in Print and in other works has mentioned that, like in colonial Bengal, Sadhu Bhasha, as I have already mentioned, the standard variety of vernacular Bangla came as the language of power, print and and where the non-standard variety of Bangla or other traditional languages took a backseat, and they were marginalized and removed from the quote unquote mainstream social and cultural discourse.
Yeah, thank you for sharing some part of your research. It will be useful for all of us to understand the idea of standardization as well as standard language ideology. Now, I will come to Abhijit again. So, the idea of the significance of standardization and standard language ideology for colonial Bengal as shared by Suma is slightly different from your work. So, will you be telling us about the significance of standardization in terms of state formation in Indian context as understood from your work?
Yes, so my work basically revolves around, or it tries to analyze the standardization process of Malayalam, which is spoken in Kerala, also Lakkadai, but then focus is on how the standardization process took place in the state of Kerala. So there are the certain differences as mentioned. For instance, we have to keep in mind that Malayalam was also subjected to many changes during the colonial period. There is no denial of that. There is even the presence of missionary Malayalam. But whether we can call that process standardization is a different question that we have to answer some other time. But for the time being, we are looking at the state-sponsored standardization that took place after the State Formation Act that was passed by the Government of India in 1956. So in this year, Kerala was actually formed as a independent state along with other many states, and Malayalam was designated as a language, and the state had to come up with a standard language that would be used for the social discourses that Suma was mentioning. But there are certain differences in how, like in the cases with many other states in India, Kerala is also rich in terms of the dialects or the varieties you can find, and these varieties also have sub varieties, if you will, depending on the caste, class and other social criteria. So when the standardization process occurred, again the ideology came into play, and the people in the power positions basically chose a variety that was more Sanskritized and that belonged to the privileged parts of the society. On the other hand, the varieties that are now considered so-called non-standard were pushed back to the margin, and they have been dealing with the repercussions of it the same. But something more interesting about something that I have found during my work is that not all states are very transparent, or they are not very upfront about the standardization or the codification process. So while a lot of work has been done in the case of the codification process of Bangla, we can't say the same about Malayalam. So we are learning more about the process and analyzing it to find out how the ideology has affected people and continues to have an impact on their social lives.
Yeah, so if we try to compare between these two situations, like the case of colonial Bengal and post state formation Kerala, we will definitely figure out that there are certain differences. And as we have seen that colonialism plays a major role in shaping languages, and also to add the tags of prestige and power to certain languages, of course in terms of standard language as well. So this is very important for us to understand that even in Indian context we have different situations. So if you can figure out about the standardization process of your own context, if you speak a so called standard language, then you can think about it differently, and if you do not speak a so called standard language, in other words if you speak a so called non-standard, you can think about the kind of discriminatory forces which are always operative in the process. So please try to figure out the differences and the relevant features related to the standardization process in your context. And it is very important for us to do two things at this point. One is to talk about whatever we have already learned about the distinction of dialect and language in terms of the process of standardization. We talked about a few important ideas when we had a discussion in the lecture of standardization, specifically difference between dialect and standard, and we did say that the traditional differences of dialect and standard are now being challenged. We can't say that only the size of a community and mutual intelligibility are the only factors for determining the differences. Rather, we are saying that now there are factors which are non-linguistic, which are political, which are very much operative while establishing certain varieties as standard. So going back to the same analogy for a dialect with army and navy. So, it is important for us to understand this entire process for a number of reasons. Initially, we will be talking about sociolinguistic features. So, we have talked about mobility, we have talked about the idea of continuum previously, which are related to standardization process. So, I hope this discussion is helpful for you and you can relate to whatever you have learnt about standardization previously. You can think about ideas of accommodation that we have discussed earlier, and you can also think about something that we will be discussing later. So, on one hand I will ask you to go back to the previous lectures and clarify certain ideas that we have already discussed, and I will tell you at this point that in some classes in future we will be talking about something called language policy. So, this lecture, this discussion will be actually creating the ground for our future discussion on language policy. So, what do we mean by language policy? You can say it is administrative policy of states, as Abhijit pointed out that there were some policies after in post state formation Kerala initiated by the government, and there were policies during colonialism in case of Bengal, as Suma pointed out. So, all these policies that were created were very much dependent on the entire process of standardization. So, when we will have discussion of language policy in future, we will come back to this, we will refer to this idea of standardization again, and then we will learn about it. So, we hope all this discussion will be useful for you, and at this point I will tell you to pay attention to the process again. So, to have a recap of what we discussed in today's class, rather discussion. So, we did talk about stages of standardization process. We of course talked about the differences previously, but today we learnt about some stages. So, if you are willing to know more about it, you can look at Haugen's work, where Haugen is talking about these different stages. And what are the stages? The first stage is selection, a variety will be selected. So, remember the idea of dialect chain or continuum that you have already learnt about, and also keep in mind the idea of regional varieties, regional dialects that we have discussed earlier. So, selection is the first stage, codification is the second stage, where we are codifying the selected variety with the help of grammar, dictionaries, etc. Third stage is elaboration of function, where we are basically trying to elaborate the function of the codified variety which was selected earlier. And as we have discussed, education is an important field where we can see that the function is visible. And finally, we talked about the last stage, the fourth stage, which is acceptance. So, we can say that the codified variety is accepted by the speakers. So, though it is accepted by the speakers, there can be some the scope for critical analysis from the viewpoint of the non-standard speakers. So, we will also try to see that when we will be talking about education and relationship with language for another lecture in future. So, I hope you enjoyed the discussion. I will see you all in the next class again. Thank you from our side.